Hello everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again. We're now going to talk about Star Trek Discovery and do a full review of the third season, which recently completed with its finale episode last week. Now, this will be a full-on spoiler review, so I have to warn you now, if you haven't caught up with the finale episode from last week, or indeed all of the previous season 3 or the previous 2 seasons, I advise you to stop watching now. Go away, catch up with all the recent episodes and then come back to this review. You can also catch previous reviews that I've done on this channel on both the season premiere and the season finale of Star Trek Discovery Season 3, and I will leave all of the links within the description as well as the end title screen at the end of this video. So to begin then, this season followed the spectacular conclusion from season 2, where the Discovery crew had to enter a future timeline to ensure that the sphere data couldn't be obtained by the dangerous AI system Control. This provided the very enticing and interesting development of the Discovery crew having to go 900 years into the future. So at the beginning of this season, we continued the adventures of the crew as they were separated at the first arc of this new season, and they had to find each other and connect and then try to find and connect with any remnants of the Starfleet of the Federation. We were in a new galaxy which have had to cope with the effects of the burn, which was a hugely cataclysmic effect which had stripped the galaxy of the precious substance known as dilithium. And this is important because many of the spaceships needed the dilithium to enable warp travel, and as a result of this it had destroyed large sections of the Federation to almost the point of extinction throughout the universe. We also had Saru in his newly anointed position as captain, and we saw the various adjustments that he was making within his new role. And as the crew made contact with Starfleet, Saru had the responsibility of bridging that gap of trust between Discovery and Starfleet, who were very skeptical about the arrival of Discovery and how they got to this point. And Saru's responsibility was making sure that the Discovery crew could earn their trust within a new Starfleet division. We also had the emergence of Adira, a young teenage investigator of Starfleet who had to review the current status of Discovery, and we later on find out that she was trying to define and establish her own origin as a symbiote of the Trill. We also had Book, who begins the first scene of this season when he encounters Michael, who we see is in the Red Angel suit, and over time we learn that he is part of a special race of people with empathic abilities who are able to communicate with various animals and organisms throughout the universe. And he later on establishes a very key and substantial relationship with Michael throughout the season. We probably get the biggest arc of the season involving Georgiou and her role as the leader of the Terran within the Mirror Universe, and we get the various conflicts with her own personality as the once very ruthless and extreme leader suddenly has a crisis of conscience, as she really has to review her past actions and make her future decisions within this Mirror Universe. And as we all know, the background of production of this show, this has huge ramifications of her existence within this particular universe as well. The main antagonist of this season is Isara, who is the leader of the Emerald Chain, who we see over the course of the story wants to get their hands on the dilithium and further their influence of the Emerald Chain within the galaxy. So what was good about this third season of Discovery? Well, as usual, the visual and audio and special effects are all of a high standard, and this is really what you would come to expect. As we all know, Discovery is one of the most expensive shows within television, and once again, as with the previous 2 seasons, it does really show on the screen in terms of a visual aesthetic sense. There is no doubt on the high quality production values that the show has to offer. Despite the often rumours that the show's budget was largely reduced this season, you can still admire at least the visual energy and spectacle of the effects that they put on screen. They really spare no expense in trying to create very much of a dazzling and visual representation of the galaxy and certain effects that go on that we see provided throughout the story. So on that front, you really can't doubt the showrunners that they did go all out to make sure at least that the show looks very gorgeous and slick on screen. There were certain characters that I liked within the new roster that we saw within this season. We had Book, who was played by David Ayala, and I think overall he was a very likeable and very charismatic presence. He did have a decent to good chemistry with Michael Burnham over the course of the season. I think his character did regress at the latter stages, which I will talk about in a moment, but I think overall he was a very likeable presence, as was also Admiral Farts, who was the main admiral for the new version of Starfleet that Discovery had come across and was trying to build bridges with, as I mentioned at the start of this review. And I liked Admiral Farts because he was a very authoritative, firm, but very fair character. At the beginning of the season, he is of course skeptical of the arrival of Discovery because Starfleet and the Federation is operating at a much more reduced capacity. He's very wary at the beginning of this story of Discovery, and he wants to make sure that they can be completely trusted before they can begin working together. And I like that. I think that adds credibility to any character who doesn't just jump in feet first. There's a thought process and a logic and a respect to any character that takes their time and wants to plan things and has a respect overall of the protocol and processes within the Federation. So I looked at Admiral Farts a lot as a character. So we're now going to talk about some of the bad points and some of the issues that I had throughout this third season. And I think unfortunately this season overall felt very bland and for the most part very uninspired. You know, as I mentioned at the start of this review, the interesting angle of season 3 was the fact that we were in a future timeline now. So now the story wasn't really beholden by any previous canon or mythology or lore within Star Trek, because as we all know, the previous 2 seasons were set in a time period before the original series. And I think the show has encountered many problems in terms of its storytelling, trying to fit its own narrative within the preset canon, and I think this is what has initiated a lot of criticism and backlash, particularly of original fans. And this is what you always get when you try to do a prequel story and you risk affecting previous canon or interrupting what has gone before. And if it doesn't tie in or if it doesn't make complete sense as what has gone on previously, then you always are going to really incur a lot of criticism. And I think the first 2 seasons struggled with that. So the attraction of this year is that going 900 years in the future, there is no need to attach themselves to any previous story, and they could really go all out in terms of really building a much more expansive season. The whole theme of Star Trek is the idea of exploration. So what I was expecting to see was this Discovery traveling and visiting all these various different species and different planets and different cultures, and we could really go all out in exploring this new galaxy. But a lot of the ideas and themes and concepts throughout these shows, they really felt insubstantial and less compelling. You know, we could talk about season 2, and for all the problems and issues, at least a lot of the ideas were a lot more weightier and on paper, in theory, at least compelling to watch. Whether we had the emergence of the red symbols, we had the search for Spock, we had the Red Angel suit and the implications in terms of the different parallel timelines, we had the sphere data, and of course the artificial intelligence. That we also had the backstory of Pike and his own destiny and fate and the time crystals. So whilst all of these ideas, they weren't really fully executed, at least on paper there was a lot more to chew on. But if we look at the third season, what did we really have? You know, we had the concept of the burn, which was mentioned a lot at the start of this season, but it kind of got shifted away into the background. So by the time it was brought again 2/3 of the way through, it really didn't feel that compelling to watch. And when we go into the burn and we see that the whole origin of this hugely significant effect throughout the whole galaxy was essentially one young Kelpian's outbreak over the fact that his mother had died, it just doesn't merit any real credibility, because you're trying to tell us that the whole reason for this hugely massive effects that affected everything within the galaxy, all the different technology and different star fleets and Federation all throughout the galaxy, all related down to one child's outbreak of emotion within a small pocket of the galaxy. and it just doesn't feel right in terms of logic or sensibility. And despite the fact that yes, there is a fantasy within Star Trek, it is a fictional universe, we always rely on there to be a certain amount of logic and sensibility without the show. And this whole idea and concept of the burn, it never truly worked for me. It never really felt important, despite the fact that they tried to have a very much of a big large scale finale. It really became more about stopping Asara's forces rather than the emergence of the burn, and to have it result in that way just never really convinced me. And I just think the concept of the burn fell flat. We of course, as I mentioned before, had the backstory of Adira. We had that whole Adira-centric episode where she had a previous host and the relationship between the two, and I think it was the 4th episode where Michael had to go with her and talk to the other hosts of the Trill. So this was their big effort to really push this character forward as this non-gender or binary character that was highlighted early on before the season had aired. But after that, again, Adira kind of got shifted way back into the background. She had a couple of conversations with Stannis and Colbert, but really that was it. She didn't really feel that important or that special to the events. So that was a bit of a disappointing aspect, and again, a lot of people will relate to the fact that maybe she was just another example of forced diversity. As I mentioned before, Book had a very charismatic presence to begin with, but again, he just faded away into the background later on, and he really was more of a supporting character and romantic interest for Michael, and he really didn't adhere to much over that. Now, this may change going forward for the 4th season because, as we know in the season finale, due to his empathic abilities, he now is able to control the spore drive. So this makes him more important going ahead for season 4. On the downside as well, this renders Stannis less important now because, as we all know, Stannis previously was the only character who was able to enable the spore drive. So it does raise this further question as the major role that Stannis will play going forward for season 4. So as I mentioned before, even the most substantial story arc, which was the 2-part episode involving Zhou Zhao, where we essentially realise that she is dying and she has to go to the mirror universe to really define her own purpose and existence. And at the end, we realise, of course, that she cannot no longer exist within the current Star Trek continuity. So she has to go forward into this alternate universe. And really, this was all just cover for the fact that Zhou Zhao now has to go away and star in her own show, the Section 31, which we don't even sure will happen because we've had talk of Section 31 really since the halfway point of season 1, and we really should have had the 1st season already, but that hasn't come to fruition yet. So even this 2-story backstory, which I think was probably the best part of season 3 because it had the most dramatic weight about it, in the end it just felt a bit inconsequential. It was just a way to get Zhou Zhao out of the way into her own Section 31. But having said that, I still did like Michelle Yeoh's performance as Zhou Zhao. Okay, maybe she was a bit much of a caricature, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of the humour and the charisma of the show came from Zhou Zhao's performance. So I think the show has lost a major asset in her in terms of the character and the personality that she brought to the series. So again, we look at the main antagonist, Asara, and I think, yep, she was a very much of a cardboard, very cartoonish character. There was no real depth or meaning or substance to her. We had the explanation, yes, that she was at the forefront of the Emerald Syndicate, but opposing from that, there was no real other dynamic to her character. It didn't really make much sense when we got to the finale, when after taking over the Discovery crew and holding them to hostage, all of a sudden she wants to negotiate a truce with Starfleet. Again, that just never made sense, never rang true in terms of validity, in terms of her purpose and what she was trying to do. And I don't think it's the fault of the actress that played her. I just think, again, it's just a character that just felt very flimsy and very one note, and it just felt more of a plot device. We just needed a symbol of evil to try and drive some more compelling storyline throughout this season, but Asara never worked for me as a villain for this show so far. We then come to, I think, what for many fans and many critics has been the biggest issue, if not only for this season, I think for the entire series, and that is the role of Michael Burnham. And I think for me personally, this is not a character that I have had an intense hate as what other critics and YouTubers who review this show have, but I can't deny that she has been very much of a burning issue throughout this series, and I think in particular, I think season 3 particularly emphasises this point the most. Now, to say that Michael Burnham has been a divisive character has really been a bit of an understatement. Many feel that she was more of a diversity pick, even though Star Trek has always been about diversity. The fact that she's a black female character as the lead protagonist of the show, I don't think that was a forced diversity, because we already had that with Commander Sisko, if you remember from Star Trek Deep Space Nine. I think for me, the biggest issue hasn't been with Sonequa Martin Green, because I think she's a very hard-working actress. She gives it her all. She's a very enthusiastic and very energetic presence. This was a big opportunity for her, because I think, as a lot of actors within The Walking Dead, she never really got her chance to shine. The problem with Michael Burnham is that she's too prominent, she's too central, she's too pivotal to really all of the story arcs. Now, many people will say, well, this is a problem particularly with season 2, when we found out that she was the key to the whole Red Angel and the time travelling, even more so in this 3rd season. If we look at nearly all of the story arcs, whether it's the searching for the burn or Adira trying to find her own existence, you know, the relationship with Book, and the whole Unification 3 episode where she was trying to broker a peace between the Vulcans and the Romulans, the whole issue with the fact that despite the fact that Saru was the captain, we had multiple scenes where Michael was over talking Saru, undermining him constantly, talking back at him, talking back at the Admiral Vance. I'd say that Star Trek, there has always been that sense of chain of command, you know, the fact that you have the captain, and then you have the number 1, and then you have like various members of the crew, and Michael really overrided a lot of the chain of command and the hierarchy protocols within the show, and it became very frustrating and very annoying. The fact that I think a lot of people like Saru as captain, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I think that was completely the right choice, but he was constantly being undermined. We had the one development, I think it was episode 5 or 6, where Michael had broke regulations and rules again. I think this was during the rescue operation of Book, and Saru made the very justifiable decision to demote Michael to science officers. So you think this is good, because this is Saru finally showing some strength and some authority as captain. But in the very next episode, Michael Burnham is back with Saru, talking with the Admiral, and once again over talking him. So it completely undercut Saru's presence and importance, and once again really underlined the fact that Michael Burnham didn't really have to answer to anybody. Any implications or ramifications that she's had to incur because of her very reckless actions at times, it didn't really matter, because she was just back to her really prominent self the very next episode. And I think this really underlines the fact that Michael Burnham, in this real effort to push her as the protagonist, it came at the expense of the other characters. And this is the other big issue that I've really had with the entire series of Discoveries, that we look at the supporting characters, and for the most part, the majority of them really feel insignificant. I struggle a lot to tell you a lot of their names, who they are, what they're about. I mean, we really have Stannis and Culber, and Stannis really is only important because of the fact that he can operate the spore drive. Culber again is the ship's doctor, but we only have their relationship to really talk about. We have Tilly again, who I think was even pushed further to the sidelines this season as what she was in previous seasons, despite the fact that we had her taking on the role as captain. Again, that never really rang true. I think the only good moment about Tilly was the fact that she alerted Saru to the fact that Michael was undermining him and that he had to do something about it. That was only really the one defining moment that Tilly had throughout this season. But again, I really couldn't tell you about any other supporting characters within the Discovery crew, and that has been because Michael has been at the forefront of everything. And if we look at the overall series of Star Trek and the various iterations, yes, you've always had the lead antagonist, and it's normally been the captain or the admiral. So we look at, of course, Kirk or Picard or Sisko or Janeway or Archer. But I think the special thing about Star Trek is that you've had this huge array of supporting characters who have always had their chance to shine, always had their spotlight, and always been a huge part of the big storylines within the show or the movies. And in many ways we could argue that a lot of the supporting characters or the other members of the crew are actually more interesting than the main protagonist of the captain or the admiral. But that's never been the case of Discovery. You know, I really can't tell you anything about the supporting characters or the other crew members. You know, a lot of the crew members from the previous shows have gone on to be the most iconic characters of the entire franchise. When we look at Spock, or we look at McCoy, we look at Data, or we look at Worf, we look at Kira, or we look at Odo, Jadzia Dax. All of these characters have made a lasting impression within Star Trek mythology, but all of the supporting characters really feel nondescript or insignificant. And I think the overall urge to push Burnham to the forefront has come at the expense of the storytelling, because if every story is about Michael or she's the most prominent figure, then your story feels weak, right? Because everything feels repetitive, it has the same result, the same resolution. Michael Burnham always comes on top, Michael Burnham always solves the issue, Michael Burnham is always the heroine when we come to the final conflict throughout. And you know, this is very apparent when we had the 12th episode, I think There's a Tide, where a lot of people alluded to the fact that it was essentially Michael Burnham performing Die Hard heroics while all the Discovery crew was hostage, and she had to take out all the Asara forces on her own. So again, why don't you involve the other characters? And I think it's to the detriment of the show, and it really limits the capacity of the storytelling that they can show throughout the season. So hopefully that's something they can fix throughout season 4 and bring the other characters to the forefront. It might actually be some benefit if we have less Michael Burnham in the show or episodes overall, and we give the supporting cast chance to shine and really become much more of the substantial arc. So really, I think that was one of the major big issues, was the fact that Michael Burnham, despite the fact, again, it's not the Sonequa Martha Green's fault, it's more of the show writers and how they're presenting the character. So hopefully for season 4 we can get less Michael Burnham being influential despite the fact that she's captain, and hopefully we can have more of the supporting members of the crew going out and with the exploration missions, and we can keep Michael Burnham to the background for a certain amount of episodes, but we'll wait and see what happens between season 4. So if I had to give an overall score for this season, it would have to be, sadly, a low score of a 6.2 out of 10. I just think despite the high production values and the obvious visual aesthetics and special effects that we always know always be a high quality, I think this season suffered a lot from very insubstantial themes and concepts and very lack of urgency in terms of the storytelling. And I think the fact that Michael Burnham was so prominent, it really came at the expense of the supporting characters of the show, which hindered and lessened the potential storytelling aspects of the season overall. And it just felt very uninspired and very much lacking in terms of creativity and imagination, and those are the things that you would never associate with a classic Star Trek story. So those are my overall thoughts and feelings of the 3rd season of Star Trek Discovery. Please let me know what you think within the comments below. Do you think this was the weakest season of the series, or do you think it was the strongest series or the strongest season of the show when in comparison to the previous 2 seasons? Where do you think the show can head going forward for season 4? How do you think the role of Michael Burnham should be handled now that she's ended this 3rd season as captain? How can we find ways to bring other members of the crew into the story and integrate them a lot more into the overall season arc, and really make Star Trek much more of a multi-layered ensemble show as to what we really associate it throughout the various and previous iterations throughout? So those are my thoughts on Venus and Star Trek Discovery Season 3. Please hit those like and subscribe buttons and help me grow this channel for you in the future. You can also check out other previous television reviews within the playlist, and I will leave the link in the description for now. So that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.